welcome, as I say, once again to Tom Slater. Tom, we talked a lot about, of course, the US election already. It's interesting to talk to Scott Lucas there a little bit earlier in the show, looking at these, who we should be looking at in terms of how they're voting, particularly young women. But I'm looking at some of the stats in terms of the polling, but also how people voted in 2020, and things obviously have changed a little bit since then. But it is fascinating how there's this idea that, well, white men vote for Trump, black Latinos, women vote for Kamala Harris or whoever the Democrat candidate is, and that they've got these clear divisions between races, genders, and the like. And actually, it doesn't really stack up. It may be sort of 60-40 or 55-45, but actually both candidates garner an awful lot of support from people of all backgrounds, ages, races, education levels, etc., etc.
No, absolutely. I mean, people are aware of the fact that Donald Trump has brought a lot of the kind of Rust Belt working class into the Republican column. What often isn't talked about, certainly over here, is the fact that over the course of these past two elections, and looking at the polls, it seems to be continuing, he has been drawing more African-Americans into the Republican Party, more Hispanics into the Republican Party in particular. There were some polls at the last election suggested he might have even got a third of the American Muslim vote, which, considering during his time in office he imposed that ban on 7 Muslim-majority countries or immigration from those countries.
4 being Muslim-majority countries.
Absolutely. Yeah. It tells you something about how the identity politics is presented doesn't always fit.
And this is the thing, isn't it? Because when you get someone saying, vote for Kamala Harris because she's white, because she's black and because she's a woman, I'm like, that is not a good reason to vote for anybody.
And people don't really do that. I mean, there's some people will, don't. But there would be a kind of, they buy into this kind of argument about making history and breaking glass ceilings. But that only really appeals to people who, to be honest, are probably quite comfortable as it is, have the luxury of just voting on the basis of virtue rather than policy.
And on their needs.
Beyond that, people just vote for the candidate they think is going to advance their interests and do things that will actually benefit their lives.
Improve their and their families' lives, improve if they've got a business or work for business, and improve the country. I mean, these are the issues. And that's where, for me, Donald Trump has the more sensible policies, to the extent that Kamala Harris has any policies, because, my God, we had a lot of vibe stuff, didn't we, before we learned about any of her policies, and I'm not sure she can say what her policies are. Certainly she can't do anything without a teleprompter in front of her, which is worrying. Now, I'd like it if Donald Trump read his teleprompter a little bit more, frankly, and didn't go, off-piste quite so often. But, I mean, I think they're both appalling candidates. I honestly do. I think that the idea that the leader of the free world, the person, running the biggest military, the biggest economy, the most impact in the world, is going to be one of these. I mean, he's not an idiot, but he's not a genius, is he? She is properly an idiot. I genuinely, I've said this before, I'll say it again, she's properly stupid. The woman, if you can't answer questions because you haven't been rote-learned into them and you haven't got a teleprompter in front of you, then you're stupid. And I'm sorry, because you're running for office. You need to be able to grasp things. Now, whether you like Clinton or not, this I thought was fascinating. We have a very different system here than they have in America, where they appoint experts often in particular fields. Like the guy running housing is someone who's an expert in housing. Then, women running healthcare is an expert in healthcare, as opposed to, a party figure. When he was sat around the cabinet, people were amazed that Clinton would always know more about everyone else's personal speciality than they did, because he's, many faults. I mean, the guy could not stop, getting,
his extracurricular activities.
His extracurricular. Now I'm trying to think words I can say on air. I can't say anything that are coming to my mind. But the guy was brilliant. Okay, in that sense, neither of these people are brilliant.
No, not at all. And I think with Kamala Harris, it's because she's got so little politics to her. She's swung wildly from one position to the other depending on what would get her elected for whatever race that she's particularly in. And as a consequence of that, she cannot talk off script because she doesn't know what she thinks about.
Doesn't remember what the last thing is she's supposed to think.
And this is why she couldn't subject herself to an interview that wasn't amongst a very on-side broadcaster or something quite sure.
Yeah.
And that is an issue that we have across the piece. I think Keir Starmer's another example of that. They're quite similar politicians in some respects. Don't really have a lot of substance to them. Mainly just would quite like the job. And beyond that, it's not entirely clear.
It's weird, that, isn't it? It's such a hard job to get to run for office like that, although not so hard if you just get anointed to it as VP and then anointed to it as the presidential candidate. You'd think you'd want to do it for a purpose. I don't believe that Donald Trump believes in anything either. But to his credit, and there's not much, I think, to his credit, I do think he's an appalling human being, when he said he was going to do various things when he was president, he did actually do them. Now, this is mind-blowing for many of us in UK politics. And on the key policy issues, I think it's just a huge, in terms of things like net zero, that'll be, forget all that madness. That will be very helpful to Britain and the rest of Europe to try and push away from that madness when you haven't got... I mean, again, the Democrats talk a good game on that while they've become the biggest oil and gas producer in the world, and they're fracking for the world. I mean, come on, it's just a lie. Meanwhile, impoverishing the rest of the world with those mad policies. On the issue of immigration, that would be very helpful for us. If he banned all the trans madness stuff from schools, that would be very good. And that we tend to get all the flow downstream from American politics. I think that would be good for us and for the Western civilization.
But I think a lot of Trump voters as well can kind of see past the excesses. I think there is a kind of core base who think that he is God's gift to politics, but I think a lot of them are voting for him with their eyes wide open, which is to say he's a blunt instrument, but at least he would nudge things in the direction of what we want. So I think there's a lot of people who think that there is just this kind of cult of Trump and all the people voting for him are blinded to his flaws. A lot of people recognise the extremities of what he's saying. A lot of people recognise his personal shortcomings, to put it lightly. A lot of people don't agree with everything that he says in every policy.
Don't like him personally, but...
But at the same time, they feel like because of the paucity of the opposition, and because how dreadful it is and how demonised they feel by that section of politics, they're willing to throw another hand grenade in there, and that could well happen.
If the Democrats were sane, if they put up anyone vaguely competent and sane, they could win this hands down.
And he was a repudiation of the Republican establishment as well, which had become just as aloof and ridiculous, and thought Jeb Bush was going to be the one who was going to be crowned the winner of that contest, despite the fact you can't even get an audience of 50 people to clap on cue. So it's a reminder that in both cases, these party establishments had become really kind of hollowed out, and he was somebody who could come smashing through them.
But also, this is something, and it's the criticisms of the left and the establishment make of Nigel Farage. Oh, populist, as if that's an insult. Populist. Well, you mean popular. You mean policies that people actually want. That's what you actually mean. And again, even most Democrats who would probably be supportive of immigration controls as well. And again, it always comes down to the economy, stupid, doesn't it? Fundamentally, that's what it comes down to. But I want to hear it from you. Who do you want to win the US presidential election? Crucially, tell me why. We had a couple of people earlier, or Shirley was saying, because it's Trump's family values she wants him to win, which frankly flabbergasted me. For Stephen, it was about immigration and the borders and basically sending a message to the rest of the Western world that you can do this. I mean, really interesting point from him. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Who do you want to win the US presidential election and why? It'd be lovely to hear from someone who supports Kamala Harris. Not many of the calls and the messages coming in. Give us a call, 0344 499 1000. You can text 87222. Get in touch on X at TalkTV. Don't forget, of course, calls are charged at the national rate. Text costs one standard network rate message. Of course, we could always just ask anyone at the BBC or Sky or ITV or anywhere else. Channel 4, because they don't even bother pretending. They don't even bother pretending in terms of who they're supporting. American elections brings that out of them like nothing before. They go around, you would think that they were the PR department for the Democratic Party, like Democratic, representatives in the UK. It's incredible. I know. Let's go to British politics. So, university tuition fees. We just spoke to our guest Andrew Tettenbaum on that. But university tuition fees are going to rise from £9,250 a year to £9,535. It's under £300 a year. They're going to continue to go up realistically. Who are we kidding? This is by inflation. They've not gone up for 7 years. I've got no issue personally with tuition fees going up. It seems if you're going to have them, they should go up in line with inflation. But the big issue that's happened here is that we've got a load of young people who are going to university now doing Mickey Mouse degrees at Mickey Mouse universities. We've got a whole load of vice-chancellors being paid an absolute fortune, 3 times what the Prime Minister earns. A load of academic staff who, when they're not on strike, they're effectively imposing a lockdown on themselves, doing everything on Zoom, not doing in-person teaching. This has now become the norm, not the exception. And the whole thing is a massive big Ponzi scheme that's ultimately going to be paid for by future British taxpayers, graduate or not, because it's just adding to our debt, because not all tuition fees are paid back. Certainly people coming from the EU ain't paying them back. A lot of British people who go to university don't ever earn enough to pay it back. I know the figures have changed quite a lot in, well, they're due, we're told, to change in coming years, because they've basically lowered the age at which you start, well, they've raised the age at which you carry on paying them off till, and they've lowered the amount you have to be earning before you pay them. But it seems to me the whole thing is an utter disaster, both for universities funding and for young people trying to get ahead.
No, absolutely. I think any argument you should make for the university system now no longer really stands up. I mean, if you think about the point of, is this supposed to be about teaching the best that's ever been thought and said to a young generation of young people? You look at the devaluation of degrees, you look at the way in which people are being funneled into degrees which haven't, if we're being totally honest, have a lot of academic worth. That completely falls down. There is also this more instrumental argument, which, you know, I have more of a problem with, but you can understand why it was compelling, that it's a kind of engine of social mobility, that for the section of kids from less well-off backgrounds who make it through that system, they can expect a lot more from it. I don't think that stands up in the same way it used to. I think for a lot of people from more working class backgrounds now who do end up going to university, they're not exclusively, it can just become a way in which they amass enormous amounts of debt for a few years and then end up back where they were started, only a lot more financially in the hole. And this is going to be an interesting question over the course of this government, which is you're going to have a series of universities which, because the economics of them no longer make sense because of tuition fees and other factors, where they could be ended up collapsing, needing bailouts and so on. So that's something which Keir Starmer's going to certainly have to deal with, because the system is
Why
so
would we bail them out? But again, we should just let them slowly close down. And it's interesting when we've seen, you know, the limit on foreign students from abroad coming and just bringing their entire extended family with them legally. Funnily enough, when you shut that down, also there's been an issue. I think Nigeria's currency has collapsed, and that we have an awful lot of our foreign students from Nigeria, obviously the language, English being spoken in Nigeria as well. And actually, you know, funnily enough, they're not getting all this money from students abroad. But we've also got the absurd situation where we don't have enough students, you know, studying medicine. We've got a load of people studying, you know, golf course management. I mean, it's utterly absurd. It's an absolute nonsense. I'd like there to be no tuition fees. I think, you know, we want people to be educated. And I used to hate that argument from Tony Blair, which is like, oh, you know, why should a cleaner have to pay taxes to pay for a doctor to go to university? Well, when the cleaner ends up at hospital, they're probably quite pleased that that doctor has got that degree, which they help pay for with their taxes. And anyway, the idea that the average cleaner is paying enough tax to pay for that is just a load of nonsense anyway. It just seems to me that we should have fewer people and doing courses that are worthwhile. So, for instance, we'll give you extra money if you're going to do something useful, like engineering or medicine or something that a job we actually need. But we also need to do so much more funding of apprenticeships, so much more funding of technical learning, of people, you know, learning, you know, building trade work. We need to build a load more houses. We say, well, we can't because we haven't got any people to do it. Well, let's trade up a hell of a lot of people. We've got hundreds of thousands of young people not doing anything. Well, you know, here's a trade. You can actually earn a decent living doing this.
No, absolutely, and that's what's been completely neglected by this policy of, you know, at least 50% of kids need to go through the university system. That's clearly not serving a lot of those young people particularly well. And it's something which has just really also had the consequence of sort of distorting the nature of the higher education system and taking it away from a situation where it should be about imparting to the younger generation the, you know, the great sort of intellectual inheritance. It's not that anymore.
And it
we
should
all
be
know
about
it isn't
excellence.
And
it really should be.
And that has gone by the wayside as well, as these
I don't think you can teach a student who's got an A grade and teach a student who's got an E grade in the same class. And I'm sorry, I just don't think you can. I think that's absurd. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, by the way. Lots of calls and messages coming in about the US presidential election, but I'd love to hear from you as well on the tuition fees issue and just university generally. 0344 499 1000. I'm expecting a lot of University of Life, and quite damn right. It's one of the things like, post-Brexit, you remember the whole, better educated people, they voted to remain. It's like, well, again, in my parents' day, you know, a tiny, under 10% of the population went to university. Well, you know what, you know, that doesn't mean people aren't clever. And
have you seen the sort of stuff that quite well-educated people say these
exactly.
days? You've got to be quite well-educated to believe some of the balmy things
people I know,
around
the really properly clever people, actually, you know, didn't do any of that, the uni stuff. It's such a load of codswallop, and it's just snobbery, isn't it? It really is. Let's talk though about in relation to this, actually, Kemi Badenoch's new Conservative shadow cabinet, various appointments. I mean, I think we all knew that, of course, that Robert Jenrick would be offered something. He's got shadow justice. James Cleverly said he wouldn't serve in a role, and we've just learnt from a source that Tom Tugendhat, who was also a Conservative leadership hopeful, turned down a job in the top team. But we've got Mel Stride as Shadow Chancellor, Dame Priti Patel as Shadow Foreign Secretary, Chris Philp, I've got to be honest with you, hard-working guy. He's come out, he's done his time as Shadow Home Secretary, former Home Office Minister. But one of the appointments I was most intrigued by and unhappy about was the new Shadow Education Minister. That is Neil O'Brien. Now, you might remember Neil O'Brien. Neil O'Brien was a massive supporter of lockdown, so much so that he set up a website during lockdowns to basically smear not just journalists like me, I'm old enough and big enough and ugly enough to take his nonsense, but he was smearing people like Professor Sunetra Gupta and other scientists who were pushing for more sensible measures under the Great Barrington Declaration and others. And basically, I mean, really nasty, supposedly fact-checking website that wasn't fact-checking at all. It was just smearing and basically trying to sort of have us cancelled and demonised. He also pushed for schools to be closed and then pushed for schools not to be reopened even in 2021, despite the fact that, of course, places like Sweden didn't close schools for under 16-year-olds for one day, and their death rate, by the way, was lower. I mean, fact-based he was not, but I've said to him personally since this that I will personally make it my mission to end his political career, because I think he's not a Democrat. He's someone to be an education minister who has demonised university professors for offering science, evidence-based, expert-based thoughts and advice on how to deal with a pandemic. I don't think you have any business being anywhere near the possibility of you being in government.
There was something about COVID which certainly brought the authoritarian streak out of a bunch of people, not just in terms of being lockdown zealots and calling for policies like school closures.
There are times like that where people show their true selves. He showed his true selves.
That kind of witch-finder general act that people could quite easily fall into. It's troubling, absolutely.
Oh, it's more than troubling. Kemi Badenoch, really like you, really hope you do well. Neil O'Brien has no business anywhere near your shadow front bench. He is a man who I believe is a danger to education and not someone who should certainly have any role whatsoever in this. I genuinely think he's an awful human being. I really do. I think what he did you can have a go at journalists, you have a go at me any time, I don't care. Doesn't war off a duck's back. But when you're attacking academic experts for giving their academic expert opinion during a pandemic when they are trying to save people's lives, I think that just makes you an appalling human being. You can disagree with them, you can argue with them, but when you set up a website to smear them, you're not a Democrat. You're anti-free speech. They were anti the freedom of children to go to schools. Nah, don't want you anywhere near. You'd be a good reason not to vote for a Tory government. Just saying.